Hello, everyone. And today, or at least I'm starting recording this today. It might take me several days to record this because there's so many Endgamers. But overall, I'm going to be talking about the Endgamers of Big Brother Canada. I've stated beforehand that I see Endgamers as people who make it to the final six. And I say this because there are a few scenarios that you could point out and predict how the season would have went had certain people went home earlier, had certain people won in HOH competitions, and it's easy to predict who would win in a jury vote against any of the other five people because you're that close to the end. And you already made it through most of the season. So, like the pre-jurors and non-endgame jurors, I'm going to rank the endgamers in the 7 tiers that I've established throughout several videos and give a brief synopsis on their journey throughout the season and how I think they'll do in other seasons as justifications for why I ranked them where I ranked them. There is no one that fits the abysmal tier, and that's usually for people who are either very early out or struggle to make it to jury. So no one fits that here. At 64th place, which is last place, is Nikki. First, I just want to say rest in peace to Nikki. But out of everyone on this list, she had absolutely no game and never even tried to have any game. She was lucky to skip the first week and was given immunity. The second week, when she came in, she immediately started having meltdowns about being a have-not and threatened to leave several times. Essentially, Nikki was used as a vote by Tim, and even Mitch to a lesser extent, throughout the entire season, and she was extremely emotional and a vengeful player. No one respected her in the game, and no one wanted her to win the season, partially because she's an international, but partially because she was just a weak player. Even her closest allies didn't want to take her to the end as a GOAT when that was her best usage. Nothing to really say about her otherwise. At 63rd is Kyra. They were a target in the first few weeks due to their meltdowns, and emotional episodes caused them to be on the outs. Kyra was the initial target during Dane's first HOH, but Mackie's several screw-ups caused them to stay in the house, though it had nothing to do with what Kira was actually doing to make sure that happened. After that, it was clear that Kira was going to make it to the end as a GOAT, but they will be used as a pawn at several points throughout the season. Had absolutely no chance of winning a jury vote against anyone, and while there were moments where they saw the bigger picture, they ignored it and would act very arrogant towards other people. So, emotionally, they were either very gloomy or very petty and arrogant. Also, kind of a know-it-all, where I could easily see them going home early on most seasons. At 62nd is Tala. There was little to no strategy with Tala whatsoever. People saw her as a floater in the beginning, but she wasn't floating, and was just coasting for the first several weeks of the season. Was brought into the East Coast Alliance because they needed a number, didn't offer anything strategically whatsoever to the season, and wasn't good at competitions, while actively pissing off many people in the house due to her meltdowns and entitlement. Apparently was a threat to win, but it was because the jury knew that she would be the most ridiculous winner ever, and it was due to nothing of her own doing. Her game is not repeatable whatsoever, and would most likely cause her to be an earlier out. At 61st is Rochelle. Played a very poor game from start to finish, now that I really think about it. Was in the group of catty mean girls, which wasn't even a tight-knit group, and encouraged them to play as catty and personally as possible. She failed at getting Heather out, and that was used to get Ika out on her HOH, which left her on a weaker position, and she wasn't even a part of the first five alliance, but got lumped in with them after Canada's HOH. She was on the outs for the rest of the season, could not infiltrate in the alliance, and wasn't a jury threat. She was decent in some competitions, and was poor in every other category, mainly socially and strategically. I could see her making it far-ish on some other seasons, but this would also cause her to be an early out on many other seasons as well, and I don't know if she has the skill set to improve on her mistakes. At 60th is Sabrina. They, meaning the edit, made it seem like Sabrina was running and masterminding the house for the first half of it, but the only person she was really running was Rachel, and she talked her into making a bad move. In general, Sabrina was being run by the other first five alliance members, and no one in the house, including her allies, respected her, so her chances of winning were very low to begin with. Of course, Canada's HOH screwed her infrastructure over, and she does become a pawn essentially for the rest of the season, as everyone knows that she is a jury goat. Her personality rubbed people the wrong way, she was horrible in competitions, and her strategy was nowhere near as good as she thought it was. At 59th is Pilar. There's really nothing there strategically to Pilar. Desperately needed to be guided by Kevin, who needed to be guided his damn self in the season, and Ashley throughout the entire season. She ended up on the block in the first week, but would have stayed even without Canada's vote. She didn't have any alliances for several weeks in the game, and was left alone because she was not threatening whatsoever, and didn't know what was going on. The Diaper Alliance was formed, and it did benefit her for sure, and she won an HOH that she did nothing with, essentially. I do think the language barrier hurt her in the game, and she was a nice woman, but I don't think she was strong socially either. I see her either getting dragged along in most seasons like she was in this season, or taken out early if she's on the wrong side. Just really nothing to say about her pertaining BB strengths. At 58th is Karen. Based on how virtually every other older woman has performed in BBCAN, Karen is extremely lucky that not only was she on a returnee season, causing her to be a smaller target, but she ended up winning the first HOH, where she could have been the first boot otherwise. After her HOH, everyone agreed to just leave her alone, since everyone in the house knew that she was a goat who could be easily beaten. Karen was out of the loop for most of the season, didn't know what was happening strategically half of the time, and was very one-dimensional in her strategy, being laser-focused on getting Kevin out, even making moves that guarantees that she won't win. Not good in competitions, not good socially, and not good strategically, who would be an early boot on most seasons. At 57th is Adele. Something tells me that I have him a lot lower than most people, but I really saw little to no good things about his game. He alienated himself from most of the house with Kyle and Paul by their actions in the first few weeks, and while he starts forming some relationships, he was never brought in a solid alliance, and when he did try with Aika, she just ended up going home next. Canada's HOH was the reason why he was in a good position, and it wasn't due to his own gameplay. We got to see how he played when he was in the majority, and it was awful. His strategy of pissing people off so he can be taken to the end and hoping that his final speech can woo people over is just horrible. And when he wasn't making poor strategic moves, like targeting the goblins when he was at the bottom of his alliance, he was playing way too much for Canada. At 56th is Will. He is someone who was doing pretty well socially at first, but then things started changing around the Jesse boot, someone who wasn't targeting him whatsoever. He started showing more of the temperamental side of him and started acting like a very whiny baby. He got very entitled whenever people didn't do what he wanted and was essentially led by Paris and to a lesser extent Maddie throughout the entire season. He was very emotional and not strategic throughout the entire season, was considered the big jury goat out of everyone who made it to jury outside of Ryan, and couldn't win a competition. Also made the dumb choice of being conned by Derek to drop in the final 5 veto, where he could have saved his allies from going home that round, and took no accountability in general. Outside of being a pouty child who can use his Eastern voice and behavior to somewhat of a benefit, he doesn't have what it takes, period. At 55th is Tara. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin with this one. No one in the house respected her for a majority of the season, and while she eventually got into an alliance with the other side, she didn't have great relationships with many of them. She tried to save quite a few of the boots that went home in the pre-jury, examples being Kyle and Austin, and failed at doing both, so she wasn't even good at spraying people. In addition to that, she was way too laser focused on Tashawn and Jetson throughout the season, where it came off disturbing at times. She became a target during the early jury phase since there was a limited amount of people on the other side, and she was used to take out Jetson, where they planned to and did take her out right afterwards. She became a threat and came back due to a twist, where she came back and always lower on people based on that. Strategically, not good, was a mixed bag at best socially, and was mediocre in competitions. At 54th is Damien. He was someone who was overhyped for absolutely no reason, and the person who represents overhype the most out of anyone in BBCAN history. He was able to see Dane and Adam make an alliance throughout the privilege he was given, and whatever he did actively caused Adam to nominate him. Most of the house was stated throughout the entire season that he barely spoke to people and would outright refuse to strategize at times as well. He stuck with Estefania and Dane throughout the entire season, and while his social game wasn't bad, it really wasn't good either, as he was just on the surface nice with people. was pretty poor strategically, wasn't good in competitions, and has a mediocre social game. Was kept around because he was the biggest non-threat out of the non-pretty boys. At 53rd is Renee. It's interesting that she came in wanting to be a social mastermind, but her biggest fault in the game was her social skills. She was at the bottom of her alliance for the entire season, and a lot of the other house guests either actively disliked her or distrusted her, so it caused her to not build strong relationships that she could use in the future for herself, and made her more reliant on Shania and Claudia. She was nominated a lot throughout the season, and it didn't help her position in the game. It seemed like she was the best strategically out of the three, since she was the only one who didn't really waver on Zach, and wasn't as easily flip-floppy like the others, but she was undercut by her own allies on her HOH, and made a final three with Ty, who was of course going to cut her, since he wanted to cut off Claudia's friends. She had some right ideas, but the execution was almost always sloppy, and there's a huge social hole that I think she wasn't even aware of, and would cause her to be a boot earlier more often than not. And the final person in this tier is Maddie. She is very similar to Renee in my opinion, as they are both big fans of the game and has a lot of solid ideas, but doesn't know how to put it together, in addition to being the third wheel in their alliances. I feel like the main difference is that she's a bit better strategically and was able to form a few individual bonds like with Johnny, but that eventually withered away. She was gaslit a lot by her alliance and was almost consistently targeted, but was able to get out of a few gems. But the biggest issue with her is that she really lacked the social game to pull off the strategy and moves that she wanted to pull, even within her alliance. People just didn't like, trust, or respect her in the house. That was always a big hurdle for her, which is a main component of why she ended up here. At 51st is Phil. I have no idea how he would play if he were on his own, and this tends to happen with people who have to play with another person. But at least unlike the others, I'm including the baby as house guest as well, he never got to play just as his own player throughout the entire season. Because he was the fan out of himself and his brother, he claimed that he knew a lot more, so they ended up following his advice where he didn't know what he was doing a lot of the time, or he would just never admit it, but he often made the wrong choices. Phil got them into some sticky situations and arguments the entire season, wanted Jared's validation the entire season, where Jared gave him his ass to kiss until his final week in the house, alienated people by not committing to anything. He had the privilege of playing with his brother, where he most likely plays worse if he was on his own, but we do see him make a stupid deal with that Cassandra was obviously going to break, and was just all over the place. Because he is unknown, I'm placing him here in this tier. At 50th is Kelsey. If she did not return, I would most likely put her in the bad tier, despite showing some potential herself. She was mainly targeted at first because some of the women were jealous of her and didn't like her budding showmance with Jared, though of course not targeting him since male privilege for you. Because Paige was a poor pawn and Kelsey had solid people working for and with her, she ended up staying. After this, she became more and more entitled, whined about damn near everything, and had the quote-unquote good people rhetoric. People saw through her game and saw her as the leader of the Third Wheel Alliance, which caused her to be booted forth, as others wanted to work with Jared and Raul without her being present. Luckily for her, she was able to not only return to the game, but was able to watch silent feeds for the week and was able to boot Mitch, but she started being called out that week for her messy gameplay, and she was also lucky that Lovita was able to give her information. She was kept around instead of Raul because she had better social relationships and he was annoying the hell out of people. Kelsey was able to rope the Paquette brothers in her alliance and was able to move on to them once her initial alliance was booted, where she was the more strategic force, and did well in the endgame competitions. The issue for her is that she had trouble admitting that she lied, could get dirty and cutthroat, but she could be a well-rounded player at times. And the final person in this tier at 49th is Marty. I already discussed him, so I'm just going to copy and paste what I spoke about him at the last time, and I'm including him and the other double evictees who were booted in the Final 6/Final 7 in both tier lists, where I included them in the jurors and the Endgamers. I put him here mainly because I didn't know where else to put him. Marty is such a chaotic and inconsistent player, where he isn't mediocre, but isn't one of the higher tiers that suggests being good, and isn't really a bad player either. It seemed like he was on the outs in the first week, but he was able to win HOH the second week and started making important relationships with people like Kyle, Gino, and Kevin. He had some other solid relationships over the next few weeks, but his chaotic and relatively toxic personality put people on ice and saw him as extremely emotional. But he was also the best competitor of the season, which was a huge benefit, and people used him as a meat shield to do whatever, mainly Kevin and Helena, where he was convinced to go after Herman on a second HOH. He was a very sneaky, conniving player, but wanted to be perceived as an honest player and was led by his emotions. At 48th is Mark. He is so lucky to have been included in the Pretty Boys Alliance, and it gave him an advantage over most of the cast, especially since he himself did not contribute much to the Alliance. His social game was awful, since most of the people who were not in the Alliance really disliked him and actively targeted him through a lot of the season. He was lucky that his Alliance protected him. He talked about targeting his alliance early on, but then folded at the quickest possibility possible and let Anthony completely railroad his HOH, which caused the house to respect him even less. And then he ends up going home in the final five when he shouldn't have been, since he was nominated against the strongest player in the house and he is the easiest goat, but he couldn't even accomplish that. He is in this tier because he was more aware of the dynamics solely because of the alliance he was in. At 47th is Dylan. He was on the outs for the first few weeks, as he mainly spoke to Emily and Dallas and voted incorrectly on their first vote. Partially because he knew John in real life, he became a parachute for the Bruno, Gavin, Nada side of the house, but he still had a big target on his back. Of course, Emily ended up going home when he was nominated beside her, which was always the plan, but he ended up being pissed off at the people who saved him because Kevin didn't use the veto on either one of them. Things did improve for him after his showmans left, as his target essentially disappeared. He was able to get out the one person who he had no relationship with on his HOH in Cindy, and grew closer with the other newbies to take out the vet and Dimitri. At the same time, he never had a chance to win a jury vote amongst most people, and he was sent home as an FU to Kevin by his closest ally at the time, who was Karen. He really isn't strategic, is okay at some competitions, okay socially, and is very emotional, so he's mediocre overall. At 46th is Claudia. I remember everyone thought throughout the season that she was going to move outside of being okay, and she never really did that. She was in a good spot with decent relationships with people, while being shielded by people in her alliance for a majority of the season. She was in a showmance with the biggest shield of the season, and she was pretty good in competitions, arguably the second best. Strategically, people were hoping that she would improve, but she never really did, and we saw her make blunder after blunder in the endgame. She was considering to keep Zach, kept on blowing the alliance with the Kuzi Daniel side of the house, and while she had solid relationships with people in the house, it never really built up to anything. It's weird that I don't have much to say about a finalist, especially since she was in the most successful girl alliance in BB history, but she was good at competitions, okay socially, and meh at best strategically. She probably does well on most seasons in not going home early, but I don't see her ever thriving to be a great or even a good player. At 45th is Gary. One of the main reasons why he is on this tier is because he was voted out in the early jury portion of the season, and it was done fair and square as well. He didn't have many allies in the season, and his closest allies left early, where he was only left with Topaz when he was eventually evicted. He wasn't playing a good game by this point, and was mainly only good in competitions. He then was given the grace to return in a vote where producers knew he would win over the other, making the final four into the final five, where he was able to skip 2 weeks and 3 rounds of gameplay. He was able to get Emmett to work with him, and it caused him to stay over Andrew, though he won the veto that week anyways. Dan had to convince him to boot Emmett, and then he accidentally lost the season due to Topaz voting incorrectly. Good at comps, meh at everything else in general, as he was all over the place socially, as he can be fun but can be cranky and kind of isolates himself at times, and needed to be heavily guided strategically, and as we have seen, he usually would place around the mid portion of the season. At 44th is William. I already discussed him, and I'm going to copy and paste what I said about him the last time into here. I think his biggest struggle during his run on Big Brother was the language barrier, where not only is French his first language, but he was not a strong English speaker. In a house where essentially everyone else speaks English, or fluent English, that is going to be a problem, but he luckily had Dre with him that could help him communicate with others better. Without any French speaker, I could see him doing a lot worse in Big Brother. Outside of that, he always talked about wanting to make a big move and to be a strategic player, but he was very mediocre at best in this element, where Ika or Dre had to coach him on what to do, and he was willing to backdoor Bruno by burning Kevin, and he saw vetoing Kevin as his one chance at a big move. Outside of that, he was very passive in the game, but he was the third best competitor in the house, which will help him on other seasons. In general, he's just very middle of the road. At 43rd is Anika. She's someone that ended up surprising people in the season based on how her preseason interviews went down. Anika said she was going to wing it, but she did pick up on the game pretty quickly, as she was persistent with Terrell on using the veto on her, making quick allies with Kuzi and Daniel, and they found themselves in the middle of the house for the first few weeks of the season, where no one was targeting them. Eventually, the Crown was formed, and it put them in a majority alliance while having a side deal with the Girly Pops, which never went anywhere. The issue is, it was mainly Kuzi and Daniel making social connections with people outside of the trio, and Anika never really dealt with people outside of her alliance. She was always quick with shutting others down pertaining strategic advice because she thought she knew better, but was more often than not wrong. And then there was her HOH, which she really botched, despite making fun of Claudia's HOH, where the same thing happened. I do think she has the ability to learn, but is extremely overconfident. She has some slight potential strategically, but is kind of poor socially and really poor competitively. At 42nd is Summer. Like the other double evictees at the final 6/several rounds during the triple, I've already discussed her, and I'm just going to repost what I said in the last video about her. I know a lot of people overhyped her before the season even started, and in the first few weeks, she definitely lived up to the hype. Of course, she was in the majority alliance of 8, and started the work for a girls' alliance, and creating her deals outside of the 8, which was impressive. People really liked her, and she was thriving socially, while being the somewhat leader compared to Tanisha and Betty, but people didn't perceive her like that. I think she got too much credit for the cow thing, but it was an example of how she maneuvered, but things completely fell apart for her when Tanisha went home and she never recovered. Everyone started to see her for blatantly throwing competitions, and she cannot regroup in different alliances, and people saw no worth in her, and her campaigning when she was on the block was really, really bad. She isn't a player that does well when she isn't in power, and it just showed that she's a mediocre player overall. At 41st is JC Lynn. She is someone who kind of bumbled their way throughout a lot of the season, since JC Lynn did not know what was happening in the house for a majority of it. It was like whenever she would get into a group, something would cause it to blow up, and she was always on the outs of it, and would have to do damage control. But when JC Lynn ends up on the outs, it's due to her being painfully strategically passive, or isolating herself from the house socially. Whenever a revelation happens, she would recover from her mistakes, would build some bonds with people, and get more involved in strategy, but she would repeat the same thing over and over, as she would either isolate herself with Gino and or Stephanie. Her final week was probably her best week strategically, where she was really on game move. If only she was like that the entire season, she would have done a lot better, and she would be a much better player, since she was also good at competitions, and was all over the place strategically and socially. I do think that if she were to magically return, or to get another chance, I do think she would learn from her mistakes and do a lot better. At 40th place is Brittany. It's clear that many people were not threatened by her initially, and it was why she became a pawn early on, and it takes a lot for certain perceptions to wear off from people. In addition to that, Sarah became her closest ally because Neha was snipped very early on, and Brittany ended up relying on Sarah too much throughout the game, despite her having potential without Sarah. The thing is, she actually had relationships with the Bruno and Bobby side of the house individually from Sarah, and better than Sarah, but she never utilized it outside of the Jordan vote. She was good in HOH competitions and took out a lot of key players, but her strategic skill is definitely debatable, especially with the Willow vote and leaving Ashley off the block, who then won the next HOH that would have normally sent her home. In addition to that, she was heavily reliant on twists, as it helped her boot Jordan with Cindy returning and being given information that none of them would have known otherwise, and she got the coup d'etat that not only directly saved her from being a 7th placer, but gave her the power to boot Bruno. I just don't think she has the self-interest in her to really thrive to be a better player. At 39th is Jedson. It's ironic that I put the co-workers right next to one another. Anyways, he is arguably the most scatterbrained person in Big Brother history, or at least what I think based on my immediate memory recall. He got in a relatively solid alliance called the Sunsetters, but he did not do great alliance management with some of the others, causing themselves this distance from him and a few of the others. Luckily for him, his side of the house kept on winning HOHs and power, and it took him pretty far into the season. At the same time, he made himself such an obvious target from very early on in the season and needed competition so he wouldn't be booted early, in addition to his allies, and would do messy things like cause pointless house meetings, make attempted flips, and continuously went back and forth about who to vote out for several weeks. All of this would cause for his own alliance to turn on him, but it would have been all for moot if he just vetoed himself in his final week, and his HOH was extremely messy. He is good at competitions, is okay to good socially, and below average strategically, leaving him to be in the middle of the road. At 38th is Beth. Like Jetson, she's also very scatterbrained, but I don't think she's as scatterbrained as he is, and didn't make as many stupid mistakes in general. Unlike Jetson, I think her main issue was her social skills, since a lot of the house guests got really annoyed with her from early on, and many of them actively disliked her. I do think she utilized her HOH well to take out Victoria, though she was trying to play both sides in the beginning, and did it poorly, and it caused her to ruin a lot of relationships. It was good that she always considered her options and wanted to have a separate game from Jetson and Tashawn, but she did the same thing that Kayla did and kept on verbalizing it from early on, so when she stuck with them, which made sense for her game, it invalidated her in everyone else's eyes. Despite that, she was a threat to win, as she was all over the place strategically, kind of bad socially, but was decent in competitions. But I do think she is overall not bad, but not good, so she's kind of just here, and I don't think she has any more potential to do better. At 37th is Peter. Like I mentioned with Alec, Peter would have done a lot better and been a much stronger player if he didn't try so hard to emulate his gameplay to what Will, Chilltown, and Dan did on their seasons, and whatever the hell the alliance Dan and Memphis had in BB10 were called. He thought that he needed to be an uber mastermind like they were, despite him not being very good at it, and often made the wrong moves, like targeting Tom prematurely, voting out AJ, and not using the veto on Topaz to vote out Andrew, where Emmett would have been more reliant on him, and he would have had more options. He actually had some good social relationships, and I think I underrated him in this element when I initially covered the season and the players, but he threw a lot of those relationships away because of him trying to be a mastermind and being misted by Emmett over and over again, where they actively told Emmett that they weren't taking him to the final two, so why would he look out for him and Alec? Where the moves gave Emmett the agency that he and Alec could have and should have wanted for themselves. I think he's okay in competitions, relatively good socially, and okay at best strategically, as he's mainly playing a role, but it leaves him as a middle-of-the-road player in my eyes. At 36th is Betty. Honestly, it is still crazy that there are some people who still hype Betty up mainly for gameplay reasons. From the beginning, she was on the outs, but she did have some decent to good relationships with a few people in the majority 8 alliance at the time. She had a target on her back in the beginning, and people consistently mentioned her name in the first 3 or so weeks, but got lucky with people like Kyle blowing up their alliances. I will say that she was always willing to make big moves and to take the shot that needed to be taken, like wanting to take Gina out in the double and knowing that Kevin was the one who needed to be booted over Helena, and I'm sure there are just pretty much more examples. She's also one of the few people who saw through Kevin from very early on in the season, so she is perceptive at times. At the same time, there were quite a few moments where she played very emotionally, actually a lot of moments where she played emotionally, and was easily convinced to do things that were not in her best interest. I think she's underrated strategically, but mediocre competitively and socially, where she probably does worse in a more stable house strategically. At 35th is Shania. It's crazy that BBCAN 11 ended about 2 months ago as I'm recording this, and even after me rewatching it a month or so ago, it is becoming a complete fog to me. She was obviously a part of the girly pops with Renee and Claudia, which everyone knew about, and it's good to have a solid alliance. Apparently, she was too focused a lot on the boys and trying to get in a showmance with Roberto or Dan for the first few weeks, which caused the cast to not respect her much as a player since she was so emotional about it. Apparently, she was the best social player out of the people in her alliance, since she did have a few connections with the other side, especially people like Daniel. A crossover alliance was proposed between them and their partners, which was a good idea, and it seemed like she was the safest throughout the entire season out of her alliance. She did make the move to veto Renee, and while it was the right move, it caused the house guests to respect her even less, and they never moved on from it. So it did worsen her jury chances, though she made the right move for her game. And then there was a double where her closest ally ended up sacrificing her to go home, since Claudia Shomant betrayed her and wanted Shania gone. At 34th is Heather. Obviously, her early season was very messy and outright poor in many elements. The first reason is that she was doing very poorly socially, and the worst part of it was that she was well intentioned, but everyone thought that she was fake, annoying, cutthroat, and they wanted nothing to do with it or her. It caused for her to be on the block quite a few times during the early weeks, and she does eventually get into a better position, but it was nothing of her own doing. It was due to Canada's HOH and the other nominees self-imploding even more, and Canada's HOH encouraging people on who to work with and who to not work with. When she's in the sloppy seconds, she was decently positioned, and her social game did improve, while showing that she did want to make moves. At the same time, she didn't see that her allies were coming for her at the endgame, and that lack of awareness makes it easy for her to be blindsided in other situations. She also didn't know that she was being targeted in Ika's HOH overall. At 33rd is Nick. He's one of the biggest question marks in BB history, just like many people who played as two people. And the other examples also include BBUS, and I'm referring to both sets of twins. Despite the fact that we will never see him on his own, and he was a lot less familiar with Big Brother compared to his brother, it caused him to follow his brother around, though he has more of the skills to do better at Big Brother on his own. Nick was very good in competitions, which always benefits people, especially in Big Brother Canada, where competitions matter a lot more. He also had a decent read on the house and his instincts, but he started doubting himself, partially due to his brother telling him to, and partially due to his lack of familiarity with the game overall. And it was his idea to essentially quit and to be nominated on their own HOH, because Cassandra tricked them. Despite being good at comps and not being as chaotic as his brother, I don't know what else about him is solid or anything above where I have him now. And the final person on this tier is Terrell at 32nd. I believe he's the first sole winner on this list. I'm not including the brothers in that, and it makes absolute sense. He was in a good position at first, since he was in a guys' alliance and had other connections with people in the house. Unfortunately, that doesn't last long because of his need to micromanage everyone and how easily jealous he gets of others, while enabling Zach, who is becoming more and more of a liability. In addition to that, he was extremely close to quitting because things weren't going his way for the first time in the season. From that point onwards, he was on an island by himself and acted like he had nothing to do with it, but luckily for him, he was great in competitions. Not only was he able to win himself to the end from the halfway point essentially, but his competition wins essentially scared the Endgamers into working with him and to not target him afterwards, since he would save himself and use his competition wins to make cutthroat moves. I think he's very inconsistent socially, great at competitions, and is a mixed bag strategically, and if he was less messy, I would consider him a solid player. But because he won the way he did, and he doesn't really seem that self-reflective, I could easily see him doing the same thing if he was on another season, but doing worse. At 31st is Kevin. Honestly, the only reason why he is in this tier compared to BBCAN 11 Terrell is because he didn't completely sabotage and self-destruct his position for stupid reasons in comparison, as things crumbled essentially outside of his control for the most part. But in general, I think that they are very similar to one another, as he found himself in a dominant/majority alliance, which lasted a lot longer, but he wasn't making relationships with anyone outside of it other than William, and only really dealt with Cindy, Netta, and Bruno within the alliance. His alliance fell apart, and due to a lack of social relationships, he essentially had nowhere to go outside of competition wins, and he was able to win out from about the final 8 onwards, if I remember correctly. And it was solely due to competitions, since he studied before the season even started. Wasn't strong strategically, met at best socially, and great competitively, but he wasn't as out of the loop as he was on his first season, so there's some slight improvement. As we've seen, he'll make it through the pre-jury pretty easily, but struggles once the jury phase starts. At 30th is Joel. It's interesting how so many people were hyping him up when the season was airing and soon after it ended, but it seemed like many people in the BBCAN fanbase forgot about him and his gameplay. He was of course in the middle floater group and had solid relationships with everyone in the house, so he was floating pretty strongly, though he was heavily guided by the others in the middle group. It wasn't until he won HOH in the 4th week where he really chose a side, but he got no backlash for it. He went back under the radar after this, and after Mitchell left, he stuck with Tim and Cassandra, where they all took over the house and were planning on going to the finals with one another. The issue was that they weren't good at competitions, and while he was planning on sticking loyal to them in the final 5, he didn't handle the situation very well, and in general, he didn't have much agency or foresight for his own agency, as he completely crumbled when he was on the block. I think he is good socially and competent strategically, but isn't strong in competitions and crumbles due to the lack of killer instinct. At 29th is Andrew. It is very fitting that he is next, since he is another person who just lacks the killer instinct. I do think that he was good socially and was rather simplistic. He was solid strategically as well, while holding his own against Jemmet in the competitions very well. He was not in any defined alliance from what I could understand, mainly early on in the season, outside of something with AJ, though he was building bonds with a bunch of other people, which would definitely help him once the jury portion started. It caused him to be safe when Topaz targeted him, and the East Coast Alliance was then formed, which also helped with them winning all the HOHs from that point onwards, essentially. He knew that he would get cut third over Jemmet, but wanted to take them to the end, and thought a lot less of people who didn't play like he did. It doesn't seem like he's someone who would learn how to play differently, even if how he played isn't working out or didn't work out, so that's why he is here. At 28th is Sarah, and she's another winner who barely made it above the halfway point and the upper half of this list, and it really adds up once you break down her game. While there were several alliances in the early parts of the season, most of them didn't even make it onto the show because there were that many. The only ones that really held on were herself, Neha, Johnny, and Brittany, and she was closer to the other two than Brittany in the beginning. She kept on losing allies during the first few weeks of the season, but luckily her relationships with Zach and Jordan kept herself and Brittany safe during the early portion. Until Cindy returns. Not only is she given information that she wouldn't have been privy to otherwise due to the pre-jurors spilling info to one another about Zach and Jordan playing the house. And then she boots Jordan, someone who wanted to work with her, over Godfrey, who never aligns with her in the season, and then ends up being the one vote to evict Willow accidentally in the triple because she overthought things. And then there was the coup that didn't leave her allyless in the final 7 and brought her pair with her to the final 4. She wasn't good in competitions, was great socially, and was a mess strategically, but she was resilient, always worked on relationships, has the ability to acknowledge and learn from her mistakes, which is a very important trait. At 27th is Dre. I already spoke about her in the prior video, and I'm going to add it in my prior comments here. For someone who was in a mixed season, meaning that the newbies in general were not only set up to fail, but to be overshadowed in all facets, Dre doing as well as she did really showed how good of a player she is. Dre laid under the radar for the first few weeks and was able to make bonds with Ika and Cassandra, and through them had other allies. She was not playing as poorly as many of the other newbies, but the fact that she was not close to the Bruno and Netta side of the house caused her to be nominated in the 4th week, and she was set up to be a mid-season boot. Luckily for her, the 6th alliance is destroyed, and while she is told about this alliance, she put herself in the position where the veterans were going after one another, and the newbies were pitting them against one another, where they sat in the middle and she was in the top position. She remained in this position for a few weeks before she started being caught for double dealing. She's good strategically and was good socially, especially as the season went on, but competitions was a problem and she lacked subtlety. At 26th is Brayden. He was extremely passive in the season and was too focused on hanging out with his friends, but he never made too many mistakes and didn't have a target on him. He was glued to Austin, and when he got himself into an alliance with half of the house, that relationship caused for him to be distant from the alliance, so poor alliance management there, and they're split up at the end of the pre-jury. But once she did leave, Brayden started to improve a lot in the game. He was making connections with many people in the house, started dropping tidbits of information here and there, and started to somewhat float afterwards, before really getting close to Tashawn near the end. I do think he got better strategically, socially, and competitively during the second half of the season, but he had a really bad start, and I don't know if he has the instincts to be a better player. At 25th is Olivia. I already talked about her in my last video, so I'm just going to copy and paste like I've done with the triple eviction players. I didn't see much difference between herself and Alejandra when I was watching the season live back in 2018, but their differences are a lot clearer now. I will say that her social game was definitely worse in the beginning, especially since she really didn't deal with people not in her alliance. Things for her definitely improved regarding the entire house socially after the first few weeks, and she maintained that, but she always had good relationships with her alliance. She booted out the one person who was gunning for her, and who had no relationship with her in Hamza, and she wasn't targeted for the rest of the season essentially. Definitely a lot better than I thought before this rewatch. At 24th is Helena. I think Helena is someone who generally has great instincts for the game and knows the moves that needs to be made. She knew that she wasn't going to be good in the competitions and knew that she was unthreatening, so she could somewhat float and put herself in a position where all the sides of the house needs her for a vote. And because of that, she could kind of somewhat control what was happening. She pretty much always knew what was happening in the house and laid low while making strong connections with certain people. The issue is, the respect was never really there in those relationships, so when she did decide to turn on Tanisha, that side of the house never forgave her for it, and that she was emotional as well as a scatterbrained follower. The main issue is that when you consistently push yourself as a non-threat, people will start to believe it, and it doesn't help that when she had competition wins, her two vetoes, she did nothing with it, and people just simply liked Kevin more in comparison. She was booted in the Final Four despite being the weaker threat at the endgame, and the jury really hated her because she had poor jury management. Her goodbye message to JC Lynn was horrendous. She has the skills, but lacks the nuances and smoothness to be in a higher tier, and the only strong category for her is being strategic. At 23rd is Daniel. It's really sad that the best endgamer from BBCAN 11 didn't even make it to the top 20 of this list. Anyways, Daniel was one of the few people on the season to be a superfan, and that definitely helped him with how to play and navigate the game, compared to most of his other house guests. He laid low for the first few weeks, didn't make himself a target, and built relationships with people in the house before deciding on the alliance that he would work with, which many people in the season didn't do. Of course, the crown was formed, and they had a good 2-week run of dominance, I guess, but even within the alliance, he didn't have much influence in it, as they consistently made bad move after bad move, which he tried to prevent, but none of them just listened to him. From this point onwards, his game was mainly about self-preservation, and he did a good job at that, while building good relationships with people. The issue is, he couldn't win a competition when he needed to, and couldn't take control of the game to change it in the direction that benefits him the most. At 22nd is Jillian. It's interesting rewatching BBCAN 1 when you realize that she became Emmett's number 1 based on default due to Tom getting booted early on. It seemed like she was close with Liza, but the latter threw her under the bus, and while she wasn't doing poorly socially, she wasn't in any notable alliances at the time, but because of who she was attached to and her being a strong competitor, people left her alone. Luckily for her, things changed to the point where Emmett had to work with her as a number 1, and she definitely had the instincts for the game, with willing to being cutthroat and making the moves she needed to make, which she showed in her second HOH, where she broke her word to Alec and Topaz in a cutthroat manner. The East Coast Alliance was great for her, since it had the 3 best competitors in an alliance where both Andrew and Emmett were taking care to the end over one another. At the same time, her jury management was horrendous. She got outplayed by Emmett several times in the season, except for the one time where she didn't vote on his request to keep Peter, and would whine about and to the jurors about not being respected. And the biggest factor is that she wasn't supposed to win the season. At 21st, and the final person in this tier is Josh. I do think that Josh has the skills to be a good or a great player if he nourished his skills more and if he was more of a fan of the game and show. People are naturally drawn to him, and he had this aura that caused people to want to work with him, and caused for everyone in the house to work with him. He was aware of this, but never actively used it to his advantage, where he could have used these social relationships to not only keep himself safe, which was done in week 3, but not afterwards, but to really control the information flow of the house and to take over the season. He was very good in competitions, where he was second or third in every competition he played in, which caused him to dominate the endgame comps when the bigger competitors were gone. So I do think he's one of the best competitors in BBCAN history, due to that consistency. In addition to that, he had a solid read on what was happening in the house, but he was essentially in most of the major alliances that took place in the season. The issue is, people thought they were closer to him than he perceived to be, or he perceived them to be, and he never really controlled that perception. So it caused a lot of the jurors to be really mad at him, and it didn't help that he ended up playing Kevin's game as the season came to a close, when he could have taken Helena to the end so he could win, and put allies who were more loyal to him that he put more in jeopardy, though those same allies he could beat at the end in the vote. He was able to stay in the final 5 when he was set to go, so that is impressive. I don't know if he's the type who can actually learn from his mistakes to do better, though. So at 20th is Tishan. The more and more time I get for my initial ranking of BBCAN 9 cast, the more and more unsure I feel about him being in this tier. He did get into a solid Sunsetter alliance, who did position themselves pretty well at first, but there was poor alliance management, where people perceived that there was a hierarchy, so it caused people like Tina to flip. After Latoya left the house, half of the house were planning on targeting him and Judson, mainly the latter, and his side had to win the next several HOHs for him to be in a good position again. While he was definitely scatterbrained, he was a lot less scatterbrained than Beth and Judson, and built better relationships, while the other two ended up isolating themselves as the weeks went on. While he did set up his endgame correctly, which is an underrated skill, he didn't care about string management at all and mainly benefited from using the shield strategy at the endgame. He can win competitions when he wants or needs to, has a pretty solid grasp of social skills and strategy, but is kind of messy, which is why he's at the very bottom of this tier. At 19th is Derek. He is someone who knew absolutely nothing about Big Brother, and it's clear that he mainly just wanted to bro down with Jesse and Will the entire season initially. That was thwarted when Jesse was prematurely booted, and sometimes your closest ally going home early benefits you in the long run, which it did benefit him, since he had to make other relationships and had to learn about the game from Kayla. The Red Room Alliance had all the control in the early portion of the season, but the entire house started targeting him and Kayla in the mid portion of the season, and they booted Mirren because of it. But like Tishan, he made it to the end mainly because he and Kayla had to win the next several HOH and Rita competitions. But they were able to realign with Alejandra and Olivia, as well as the trio, where they were able to stay when both were on the block, but he had to win the veto to do it. He started to have better social relationships than Kayla as the season came to an end, and was able to trick well in the final 5, which is why he became the biggest story threat at the endgame. I think he's someone who learns as he goes, is inoffensive enough, good at competitions, and has a solid social game, but he's never as great or has a moment of being great as the others, and I don't know how well he would do if he wasn't with Kayla. At 18th is Zach. Now that I'm thinking about it, he is one of the most twist-screwed people in BBCAN history, but the thing that makes him stand out is that he was twist-screwed by more than one twist. He was in a great position for the first half of the season, where he was in the Chop Shop Alliance, though he was nowhere close to being loyal to it, but they weren't aware of that, and had relationships with the other side of the house as well. With him being partnered with Jordan and them working both sides of the house, everything essentially went through them, and they controlled what got back to whom, and who would end up going home. No one was catching on to the game until the returny twist happened, where the pre-jurors were sequestered and were allowed to compare notes, where they realized himself and Jordan were running the house. He and Jordan made a series of dumb moves in that week, and he got scared of the twist to rectify that mistake, which ended up costing him his closest ally. Despite that catastrophic week, Zach was able to actually recover. He played with his Diaper Alliance, that won the next few HOHs, was playing very openly, compared to being behind the scenes like beforehand, and was able to make it several rounds despite being targeted and the biggest shield ever, while also avoiding the twists of the triple and the coup d'etat. I feel like in a season without twists, he would do amazing. He's great socially, solid strategically, though he's good when he's working with certain people and knows when to win and throw competitions, but his lack of threat management is arguably his biggest fault. At 17th is Godfrey. He is someone that I get more and more confused about the more time goes on, and I have to sit on his journey throughout this season. He was able to lay low, and as a black man with his physique/build, that is an extremely impressive feat. But he did this because he apparently was overplaying in the first week, and it built a target on his back, so he had to rectify it. Godfrey was close to the Chop Shop alliance, while never actually being in the alliance, and would appear to make himself weaker, which caused for no one to target him in the first few weeks. He was the pawn that ended up being the target due to Zack's HOH, or during Zack's HOH due to the twist, and the latter not wanting to backdoor Bruno, which would have been bad for Godfrey. Of course, he then used his speeches as a strategy to make it clear who he was targeting, and people felt comfortable keeping him around because they all knew he was going after Zack. And then he played both sides of the house for the rest of the season and was very aware of the position he was in. The issue is, he didn't explain his game well enough to the jury, so they really thought that he did nothing and affected his jury chances, especially when he chose the wrong person to go to the final two with, in Sarah instead of Ashley. I do think he could pull a similar strategy or even grow from what he did on this season as he improved socially and strategically while comps weren't his thing, though he did throw quite a bit, and it'll be interesting to see if he was able to do the same strategy but make it more visible to the jurors in another season or scenario. At 16th is Kayla. She's most definitely an interesting person to talk about. Kayla got herself into a 4-person alliance with Jesse, Paris, and Derek, but that didn't end up lasting long, but she didn't sink with the ship like the other two, despite them all ironically making to the final 3. There was somewhat of an alliance with the Red Room, and it benefited all of them for a while, where she had good relationships with all of them but Johnny, and she was able to talk herself from being nominated on Hamza's HOH. The relationship between Alejandra and Olivia became an inconsistent thing during the early to mid weeks, but they were able to repair it soon afterwards. Her target grew during the Marin vote-out week, where he was sent home due to getting close with herself and Derek. From this point onwards, she and Derek were heavily reliant on competitions and was able to throw a twist that was supposed to screw her, which is Canada's veto. She and Derek ended up using the trio and Ali and Olivia to accomplish their goals over the next few weeks and fought off Johnny going after them, where she was able to survive the block against Alejandra and Johnny was finally defeated. Despite being the leading strategist of the pair, she was less liked in comparison to Derek, and she was not only seen as a complete game pot while having a contentious relationship with the first juror in Ryan, and consistently mentioning that she would cut Derek and angering the jury when she didn't do so. I do feel like there are some social holes in her gameplay that has her not excel to the great, or even being higher on this specific tier. At 15th is Ashley. It's interesting how Ashley is almost always overlooked, though I think out of all the women in BBCAN, I would have the most confidence and faith in her consistently doing well. She was brought into the Chop Shop Alliance, and it wasn't due to her affiliation with Zack, and while she wasn't very loyal to them, she wanted to keep them in her back pocket, and made allegiances with people like Pilar. I think the only one who didn't care for her early on was Brittany, who wasn't even targeting her, per se, and she was very under the radar. She was very instrumental in forming the Diaper Alliance, since she had many of the connections that brought the 5 of them together, which included Zack and Jordan, and was the most strategic person in that alliance. It wasn't Zack, whose reads became more inconsistent after Jordan left, but unfortunately only Pilar listened to her in that alliance. She started winning when she needed to, which is an important skill, remained calm when she was blatantly twist-screwed on her HOH, and was able to get through the triple eviction that should have cut half of her numbers, and remained calm when the coup happened. She was a threat to win at the end, and I think she is very well-rounded, but the agency isn't the strongest, which is why she is here. And the inability to really get people to listen to her, even if what she's saying is correct. At 14th is Paris. I struggled a lot with her when rewatching and analyzing the season, since it reminded me of the bloated edit she got compared to how she was on the feeds. Strategy is definitely not her strongest suit, since she's extremely scatterbrained and did not have agency, meaning that she couldn't utilize her strategy for a majority of the season, as she tried to convince people to keep quite a few of the pre-jurors, but no one bit. In that case, she is like Ashley, who is right below her. I will say that she is one of the better social people in the season, as she really did speak to everyone, built bonds with them, and made them feel good when they were on their way out of the house, and while they knew she could be somewhat two-faced, they never saw it as her being mean, and it was strictly for game purposes. She was able to position herself, Maddie, and Will to be the swing vote in most of the jury votes, and even in some of the late pre-jury votes, which was definitely cool, which led to the risky choice of keeping Kayla over Alejandra and reuniting with her old allies in Dela. I think she would prove more of her skills if she was on another season, and that is why she is higher than I would have otherwise put her, despite my issues with her edit and some of her gameplay. At 13th is Dimitri. He was very close to being a first boot, but luckily put in the work beforehand with certain relationships that would cause him to stay when Bruno and Kevin pulled off their last minute stunt. He did end up in the group of 6, but I mainly think that happened only because he became the second HOH and people needed to kiss his butt. In general, he mainly was guided by Aika and kind of went along with what she wanted, but he would make their approach more stable and simplistic, as Aika tended to overcomplicate things and would change her mind a lot. But he didn't build strong relationships with other people in his alliance, with the exception of Cindy. After the double, his target grew a lot in the game, where he had to win competitions in order for him to stay in the house, and while it's great that he's one of the best competitors in BB history, and went against the GOAT competitor in Kevin, he was not able to convince people to keep him in the house with his social skills. Until the final 5, where Karen kept him over Dylan on the block. It was impressive that he and Aika were able to survive, despite being nominated together twice. I think he has a solid enough social game, though there are some holes in his social game where people don't feel too close to him. A growing strategic game, and is a great competitor, so he is well-rounded, and I think he would be a little more cutthroat without Aika being there if he was on another season or in another situation on his own. At 12th place is Kiefer. With BBCAN 9 being known to have one of the weaker casts strategically, I was shocked with me placing Kiefer this high on the list. While he was with the Sunsetters for the entire season, he did have relationships with people who were not on his side, but he didn't come off as a floater like Tina did, so he was able to manage that role really well. I do think he was one of the better strategic forces in the season, which doesn't seem much at all, and he had no choice to be such after LaToya left and Tina deflected, and when he had his mind made up, he stuck to it. He was the one who got Victoria to admit that she was the secret HOH, had her not target his allies, and he won the HOHs that dismantled the other side of the house, while keeping Tina and Tara as parachutes, where he had an alliance with them as well. His huge fault is that he is very cocky and likes to brag about the game that he's had, which he was doing from very early on in the season, so it shouldn't have been a shock when his allies turned on him. And while it was kind of impressive that he convinced them to keep him after they nominated him, it still three of the more scatterbrained people in Big Brother history, so it's not as big a video. He is good at competitions, is good socially, and solid strategically, though I can see him being inconsistent if he was on other seasons, since he isn't an immediate threat like the others, but his cockiness could rub people the wrong way, and it wouldn't be shocking to me if his gameplay could only work in a season like BBCAN 9. At 11th place is Adam. My opinion on him as a player did go down after rewatching his season, but I was expecting him to be lower ranked in the good tier. But with everything said and done, just missing the top 10 is a good spot for him. He did enter the season with a preset strategy of replicating the Brigade Alliance, and he did that well, even before becoming the first HOH of the season. It worked out for him, especially because two other men in the Alliance were the best players in the house, so it caused him to be relatively safe, where that might not have been the case if the Alliance didn't exist. I mention that because a lot of people who weren't in the Alliance were actively targeting him, that he was unlikable, angry, cocky, and somewhat sexist, which was individually from Samantha. He was able to bond with Samantha, Chelsea, and Kara, which showed that he could work with women and people who weren't like him, and they were genuinely looking out for him more than his own alliance was. But he was so tunnel-visioned about going to the end with 3 men, and that tunnel-visionness is a worrying trait if you are on other seasons. Throughout the season, he got very emotional and confrontational at times, but then it turned into people seeing that he had a huge heart, and his social game genuinely did turn around, where people wanted to work with him, wanted him to win, and enjoyed his company a lot more in the second half of the season. I think he is great competitively, one of the best, became a good social player, and is relatively solid strategically, and he does have the potential to be more wide-ranging pertaining his strategy, since he had many different sides, but he didn't actively use to its advantage, but being tunnel-visioned and being very emotional and volatile at times is why he missed my top 10 Endgamers list. At 10th place is Aika. I'm going to state it now. She's one of the 8 people in BBCAN history to be given a chance to return, so I do hold that against her, and it's not as impressive as dominating on your first time. So when I do rank all the players at once, with me combining both of her seasons, don't be surprised if she's not in the top 10. With that out of the way, her game was extremely impressive with how she was able to be in the middle of the Netta Bruno side of the house and the Cassandra side of the house in the first few weeks of the season. She knew that it was not worth saving some people, but also knew that she would have to strike against the side when the time came, which is what she did when the double eviction came around. Aika had the bonds with several of the newbies in the house and was able to have a ride or die in Dimitri, who won competitions, so when they were targeted from that week onwards, they were able to convince people to keep whomever else was on the block and completely outplayed most of the vets when they weren't HOH. When she found out that Dre was plotting against her, that was squashed and handled within a day as Dre was booted. The thing she couldn't prepare for was Kevin's competition run, and while she had a good moment socially, she also had a really rough moment. And she wasn't going to win against many people in the end, and she was perfectly fine with giving up her game so Dimitri could win and advance. She did improve on some of her faults from her first season, mainly on strategy, but got weaker in other elements, like competition wins. In general, I do think Aika is a very inconsistent player, which is why she is only at 10th, despite her strong run in BBCAN 5. At 9th place is Cassandra. She is someone who has a lot of fun playing the game, and because she is enjoying herself so much, you can just not help but get invested in the way she's playing the game. Cassandra was of course in the middle group, but she was also closer to the trio side due to knowing Jung in real life and also liking Kelsey, compared to the Dallas side of the house. Cassandra was trying to build something with Levita, one of the reasons why Shari was booted instead, but it got her on the block, but luckily her bonds caused her to stay in the house. She did get very close to Tim, and they became a duo as the season took place, but the middle group started disintegrating during the Maddie vote, where she did lose that war and was a target from that point onwards. Kelsey coming back and booting Mitchell helped her more than she probably even realized at the time, since it put herself, Joel, and Tim in a power position again, and they let the Maddie versus Kelsey sides war take place for the next few weeks. Of course, there was her HOH where she took out Jared. While it was a good move, it also earned her a lot of ire from some of the house guests. Cassandra has a way of making amends with people and drawing them in, even after she had already stabbed them in the back. She was a threat to win in the season, but she definitely had her sloppy moments, which is why she's not higher on the top 10 list. At 8th place is Tim. The way Tim played the game was very interesting, especially since he not only played, but won BB Australia a few years before doing this season. He was lucky to come in at the second week and got immunity then as well, but he played dumb and had people explaining the game to him and all the dynamics in the house that was happening. He was able to blend in with the middle group immediately, and really started to play the game and pick up on it, which is a strong trait as well. When he was HOH, he decided to do Australian nominations, where everyone had to nominate based on gummy bears, which caused him to know more about the dynamics of the house, how people played, and he can take the blame off himself for the nominations. He was getting outplayed by the end of his HOH reign, and benefited from Kelsey returning to boot Mitchell, even though he didn't realize it. He knew when to kiss up to people, make people feel comfortable, and to tell them what they want and or need to hear. At the same time, he is definitely a bit too reckless, didn't care to study for the endgame competitions, didn't understand certain metas of Big Brother North America, and can get easily frustrated where he quits things and rewrites narratives afterwards. And the final person in this tier at 7th is John. He is someone who knew next to nothing about Big Brother and ended up completely picking up on how to play the game, which is an important skill set, though he was heavily guided by Netta in this element, hence why he isn't as high as some of the others with this similar skill set. He was able to get in good with the men of the first five alliance, even if he couldn't stand Andrew, and was able to make early bonds with people not in that structure as well, though he really wanted to work with Kenny, but was rejected. It did seem like he was going to be the next target before Canada's HOH, and while he did win the veto the next week, he benefited from the change in dynamics that Canada's HOH provided him, where the others wouldn't have targeted the first five without it. The sloppy seconds was created, which was very important for his game, and he was in the middle of that structure. He was tricked into targeting Arlie a bit too soon, but he was able to win competitions for the rest of the season, causing him to never be on the block during eviction, and was smart enough to cut Netta at the end. In general, I think he has the natural skills to always do well, but I don't think he was a great like the ones above him. At number 6 is Johnny. I already talked about him in the last video, so I'm just going to copy and paste what I stated about him there and put it here. And at first is undoubtedly Johnny from BBCAN 6. It isn't a shocker that he ended up being number 1, as he controlled a lot of the things that happened in the game and controlled things a lot sooner than the edit showed. He was the main reason why Jesse ended up going, and it was the start of him targeting his own red room, and was the only one from that room to have a lot of good relationships with people in the right room, which is why he was better positioned than the others. He was able to freak out enough in the double to get Olivia to not target Maddie, though he kind of lets this relationship go as the season went on, and was able to convince people to keep him when he was on the block against Ryan, and having them think it's their idea. He is able to get out of so many sticky situations and is able to manipulate things his way while being very good in competitions. His main issue was being too blinded by Dayla, and it caused him to lose flexibility in this last week in the house. In 5th place is Netta. Based on her gameplay in this season, Netta is definitely one of the best. She came in the game knowing that her best bet was to lay under the radar and to come off as non-threatening while solidly building relationships with people while not getting personal. She did a very good job at that, though her main allies in some of the women were extremely fishy and was a sinking ship. Luckily for her, Canada's HOH came in and it put her in the position for a big dog to go, where she admitted that she wouldn't have made the move herself that week without it, and it told her who was liked and disliked by Canada, where I do think it helped her form the sloppy seconds. She utilized her HOH well in getting out Kenny and to make sure that there is no other side, and was great at neutralizing people before they became a problem in the future, like Arlie and Allison, and convincing the goblins to boot him with a lot of hard work. Netta knew when to throw competitions and when to win competitions, which is an important skill, and always thought things through and thought ahead more than the others. While she isn't the greatest socially, I do think she is solid in this retrospect and knew how to be cutthroat while not coming off as malicious to the house guests, which is why she became a threat to win with a repeatable strategy. At 4th is Emmett. With this recent rewatch and making BBCAN 1 compilation videos as I'm recording this, I do see a few more of Emmett's flaws, and I think the main one is that he kind of lacks empathy. I don't think he's a completely cold guy, as he would have done a lot worse in the season, but it has me thinking that he wouldn't do as well in an environment that is more diverse in age or other demographics, compared to how things were in BBCAN 1. At the same time, he is still one of the best players in Big Brother overall. He picked up on the game extremely quickly, despite not knowing anything about Big Brother, being nominated and remaining on the block during the first night of the season throughout the first week. He mentioned that he is a great listener, lets people talk about themselves, and doesn't give away too much information. We saw him get into the Quattro Alliance and form good relationships with many of the others in the house, while being the sniper in the side in a lot of the early boots, like Anil, Liza, and a few others. Once Tom became a liability, and knowing that he was third with the Shield, he pivoted into making Jillian his number 1 and forming the East Coast Alliance with Andrew and later Tala, which ended up dominating the season, or the second half of the season, where they won most of the remaining competitions, but he didn't need to win those competitions, since most people in the house weren't targeting him anyways. At the same time, because the jury were so bitter against Jillian, they didn't want to reward him anything unless he was beside her, but he always thought several steps ahead, and his game still holds up well a decade later. The bronze prize of 3rd goes to Anthony. In a lot of ways, he does remind me of Emmett, which might have been why Emmett shaded him immediately after BBCAN 7 ended, as they both knew nothing about the show before joining it, picking up on the game extremely quickly, and was able to mastermind most of the moves throughout the season. He literally gave people speeches for the nomination, veto ceremony, and eviction speeches, and they would end up doing the speeches, even though it did nothing but help Anthony's game. He was the pushing force to get Smekey out of the house in the second week, as Dane was still relatively unsure for a while, was the main person who turned the tides against Chelsea, and so much more in the first half of the season, where it was all ignored by the edit. He was able to keep a low profile, despite being the largest man in the house, was able to missed people into doing whatever he wanted them to do, and built good relationships with people who weren't in his alliance. He went the entire season not being nominated, and had to be screwed for things to not go his way during Mark's HOH, who he convinced to do what he wanted, while keeping the pretty boys in line. I do think his lack of fandom definitely hurt him with what the jury wanted from their winner in the season, and he definitely can get a bit too arrogant at times, but those easy mistakes could be fixed, or those are mistakes that could easily be fixed, and despite his reputation, I think his lack of cop wins benefits him in many future scenarios, where it doesn't make him come off as threatening as some of the others who like him, but are also comp beasts. The silver prize of second goes to Kevin. Out of the people who made it in this tier, it's clear that he played differently to almost all of them, which makes this tier interesting in comparison, since he's such a huge outlier. He was on the out in the beginning and was on the block the first week, and his name was thrown out as a pawn star for the first few weeks, but he was able to get out of it. He focused on laying low and building relationships throughout the first few weeks of the season, so when he eventually did make a coup, he would have the numbers and relationships to do so. We saw this in week 5, where he gathered the numbers to boot Tanisha, and then the other side of the house completely dismantled. And despite booting Jess over Gino, he was able to convince Marty to break his deal with Herman to send him home the next week. He didn't need a twist to do this, unlike John and Neda, which is why he is higher than them. After that point, Kevin and Helena just took over the game, and he didn't need to win competitions to do that, and while it became clear that he was cutting people, especially Gino, the house wasn't better against him, since he had a much better social game than Helena. He was able to have Josh piss off his allies during the double, and had him keep him in the final 4 over Helena. I think Kevin has all the skills to do well in Big Brother, except for the competitions, which is the component that isn't the strongest, like strategic and social ability, and the ability to pivot and learn from your mistakes. But he would be in danger more often than the number 1 in other seasons, hence him only being here. At first place is Dane. Such a predictable number 1, but it's an easy and most sensical one, unless a bunch of the upper tier people return, which seems very unlikely, and or someone usurps him from future seasons. His intention was to come into the game and make a solid alliance. It just so happened that he was approached to be in the Pretty Boys, and went by that, where he and Adam won the first 2 HOHs, so it wasn't his intention to only work with guys, unlike Adam. Half of the house should have been pissed off at him for blindsiding them with booting Mackie, but no one was upset at him whatsoever. Chelsea was the only one at the time to completely see through him, and she ended up going home immediately, where the same thing ended up happening to Samantha shortly afterwards. It was always Anthony and Adam going at one another in the alliance, and everyone kind of just being annoyed at Mark. So Dane was always the one who had the best relationships in the alliance, and his side pieces in Estefania and Damien were the last 2 ones remaining. He knows when to play dumb, he knows when to make the cutthroat choices, he's great at competitions, he knows what the jury wants, and knows how to use his social skills to benefit him. In general, I just think he's the most well-rounded out of the BBCAN players, especially after he made it through the final 5, where he definitely should have been the boot, and would be in the least danger in most seasons. So that is the end of me ranking the BBCAN Endgamers, and me ranking the BBCAN players based off of whether they're pre-jurors, early jurors, or Endgamers. And this is the end of my BBCAN coverage for a while, where I'm talking about the season. Of course, I'm still going to be making compilations of several seasons for the next few months or the rest of the year, and I'm thinking that I'm going to make a ranking list of their gameplay, of course, on all of the players, which will probably just be me copying and pasting what I wrote in the 3 videos and maybe adding additional information, but I'm probably going to make that around Big Brother Canada 12 or closer to when that premieres. So thank you all for watching, and I will be back with another video soon. Bye!